The gunshot echoed across the valley as Gabriella O'Connor raced toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. It was 1878 in the Montana Territory, and living alone on her small homestead had taught her that curiosity could be dangerous, but indifference could be fatal. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ponderosa pines as she followed the winding creek that bordered her property, the hem of her faded blue work dress catching on brambles as she hurried. Gabriella slowed her pace when she spotted him, a man's body sprawled near the bank of the creek, blood seeping through his shirt just below his shoulder. His hat lay a few feet away, revealing thick dark hair. From the looks of his worn leather chaps, dusty boots, and the six-shooter still holstered at his hip, he was a cowboy, likely from one of the larger cattle operations that had been pushing into the territory. She approached cautiously, her father's old hunting rifle gripped tightly in her hands. As she drew closer, the man stirred, his eyes fluttering open to reveal a startling shade of blue. Despite the pallor of his face, she could see he was handsome, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. "Don't move," Gabriella commanded, keeping her distance. "Are you alone?" The cowboy grimaced, attempting to sit up before falling back with a groan. "They're gone," he muttered through clenched teeth. "For now, who's gone?" she demanded, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "Rustlers," he managed, pressing his hand against the wound. "3 of them. They took off north with a dozen head." Gabriella hesitated, then set her rifle down and knelt beside him. The wound was bleeding steadily but didn't appear to have hit anything vital. "I need to get you back to my cabin. Can you stand?" The cowboy's eyes focused on her face for the first time, seeming to truly see her. "You shouldn't have come," he said weakly. "They might circle back." Gabriella tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it firmly against his wound. "Then stop needing me," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Now, are you going to help me get you up, or shall I leave you here to bleed out while we argue about it?" A flicker of something, perhaps admiration, crossed his face before he nodded. "Zachariah Ashford," he said through gritted teeth as she helped him to his feet. "Most folks call me Zach." "Gabriella O'Connor," she replied, supporting his weight as best she could. "Most folks don't call me anything, as I prefer to keep to myself." "Well, Miss O'Connor," Zach said, his breath catching as they took a stumbling step forward, "I'm obliged for the assistance, though I can't say I'm pleased to make your acquaintance under these circumstances." The walk back to Gabriella's cabin was slow and painful. Twice they had to stop when Zach's legs gave out beneath him, and by the time they reached the small clearing where her cabin stood, the sun had nearly set. The modest log structure sat amid a carefully tended garden with a small corral to one side where her mare and milk cow watched their approach with mild interest. "Almost there," Gabriella encouraged, feeling Zach leaning more heavily against her with each step. His shirt was now soaked with blood, and his face had taken on an alarming gray tinge. As they reached the porch, his knees buckled. She managed to keep him from falling completely, but they both ended up kneeling on the rough-hewn boards. "Sorry," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "Don't apologize," she replied briskly, helping him through the door and toward her bed in the corner of the one-room cabin. "Just stay awake." Once she had him situated, Gabriella worked quickly, lighting lamps and gathering what she needed: hot water, clean cloths, the whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, and her mother's sewing kit. Her experience tending to injured animals on the homestead would have to suffice. The nearest doctor was in Thompson Falls, a full day's ride away. Cutting away, Zach's shirt revealed a lean, muscular torso and a bullet wound that, thankfully, appeared to be a clean through and through. "You're lucky," she told him as she cleaned around the entry wound. "The bullet passed straight through," Zach hissed as the whiskey-soaked cloth touched his skin. "Doesn't feel particularly lucky at the moment," he said through clenched teeth. "It will when you're not dead from infection," Gabriella retorted, continuing her ministrations. "What were you doing out there alone, chasing rustlers?" "Wasn't alone at first," Zach explained, his voice strained. "My partner and I split up to cover more ground. When I spotted them, I fired a warning shot. They responded less politely." Gabriella threaded a needle with steady hands. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "You might want to take a swig of this first." She offered him the whiskey bottle. Zach accepted it, taking a long pull before handing it back. "Go ahead," he said, bracing himself. To his credit, he remained conscious throughout the ordeal, though beads of sweat formed on his brow and his knuckles turned white from gripping the edge of the bed. When she finally tied off the last stitch, he exhaled slowly. "You've done this before," he observed, watching as she bandaged the wound. "On horses and cattle," Gabriella admitted. "Never on a person before today." Zach's mouth curved into a hint of a smile. "I suppose I should be grateful you didn't treat me like a steer." "The night's still young," she replied dryly, but returned his smile briefly before rising to wash her hands in the basin. The first signs of fever appeared shortly after midnight. Gabriella had been dozing in a chair beside the bed when Zach's restless movements woke her. Touching his forehead, she found it burning hot, his skin slick with sweat despite the cool night air coming through the open window. "No," he muttered, tossing his head from side to side. "Get back." "They're coming." Gabriella soaked a cloth in cool water and pressed it to his forehead. "SHH," she soothed. "You're safe now." For hours, she battled his fever, regularly changing the cool compresses and coaxing him to drink water when he was lucid enough. As dawn approached, he became more agitated, calling out names she didn't recognize and once reaching for his absent gun. "Sarah," he cried out at one point, his eyes wide but unseeing. "Run!" Gabriella caught his hand as he tried to rise. "Lie still," she urged. "You'll tear your stitches." His wild gaze focused on her face, confusion evident. "You're not Sarah." "No," she agreed gently. "I'm Gabriella. You're in my cabin. You were shot, remember?" Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. "The rustlers," he murmured. "That's right, now rest." He complied, sinking back against the pillow, but retained his grip on her hand. "Stay," he whispered, his eyes already drifting closed again. Gabriella hesitated, then seated herself on the edge of the bed, allowing her hand to remain in his. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised quietly. The fever broke just before sunrise. Gabriella had finally succumbed to exhaustion herself, nodding off in her uncomfortable position at the edge of the bed. She woke to find Zach watching her, his eyes clear and alert despite the shadows beneath them. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Gabriella straightened, suddenly aware that their hands were still entwined. She withdrew hers quickly, smoothing her rumpled skirt. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of longhorns," he admitted. "But considerably better than yesterday, thanks to you." "You should thank my father," she replied, rising to stoke the embers in the fireplace. "He insisted I learn how to treat injuries when we first moved out here, said there'd be no doctor to call on if trouble found us." Was he right? "Did trouble find you?" Zach asked, carefully adjusting his position to watch her move about the cabin. Gabriella paused, her back to him. "Yes," she said simply. "It did." Before Zach could inquire further, a pounding at the door startled them both. Gabriella grabbed her rifle from its place by the door, positioning herself defensively. "Who's there?" she called. "Miss O'Connor, it's Deputy Marshal Carson. I'm looking for a wounded man who might have passed this way." Gabriella glanced at Zach, who nodded slightly. She lowered her rifle and opened the door to reveal a tall, weather-beaten man with a silver badge pinned to his vest. Behind him stood a younger man with anxious eyes. "He's here," Gabriella confirmed, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Shot yesterday by rustlers." The deputy nodded grimly as he spotted Zach. "Figured as much when we found your horse wandering near Settlers Creek, Ashford. Fletcher here's been worried sick." The younger man, presumably Fletcher, moved to Zach's bedside. "Damn it, Zach, I told you to wait for me before going after them." Zach grimaced. "They'd have been long gone if I had. Besides, I managed to wing one of them before they got me." The deputy turned to Gabriella. "Madam, I appreciate you taking care of one of my deputies, but I should warn you those rustlers are part of the Blackwater gang. If they figure out Ashford survived and is holed up here." "Blackwater gang," Gabriella repeated, her face paling slightly. "I've heard stories." "All true, I'm afraid," the deputy confirmed. "Led by a mean son of a man named Victor Holloway. They've been terrorizing ranches from here to Wyoming. We need to get you somewhere safer, Zach," Fletcher insisted. Zach attempted to sit up but fell back with a groan. "I don't think I'm going anywhere today," he admitted. The deputy considered this, then nodded. Fletcher, ride back to town. Get Doc Wilson and bring back at least 4 more men. We'll set up a guard here until Ashford can be moved." "No," Gabriella interjected firmly. "I won't have my home turned into a garrison." "Miss O'Connor," the deputy began, but she cut him off. "My homestead has remained peaceful because I keep to myself. The moment it becomes known that I'm harboring a lawman, that peace is shattered." "She's right," Zach said unexpectedly. "Fletcher, get the doctor, but keep this quiet, no posse." The deputy looked unhappy but nodded to Fletcher, who departed quickly. "I'll stay until he returns," he told Gabriella. "After that, I'll respect your wishes, but I can't leave one of my men unprotected." "He won't be unprotected," Gabriella replied, lifting her rifle slightly. After the deputy had settled himself on the porch with a cup of coffee, Zach regarded Gabriella curiously. Most people would welcome the protection. Gabriella busied herself preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. Most people haven't learned that drawing attention can be more dangerous than facing threats alone. "Is that what happened to your family?" Zach asked gently. "Trouble found them," Gabriella's hands stilled momentarily. "My father died of pneumonia 3 winters ago. My mother passed the summer after that, heartbreak mostly, though she called it fever. And you've been out here alone ever since." Zach couldn't hide his surprise. "Not everyone needs company to survive, Mr. Ashford," she replied, bringing him a bowl of the mush sweetened with a drizzle of precious honey. "Zach," he corrected, accepting the food, "and it's not about needing company, it's about having someone to watch your back." "Is that what Sarah did?" Gabriella asked, immediately regretting the question when she saw the shadow cross his face. "I'm sorry, you mentioned her name during your fever." Zach set the bowl aside, his appetite apparently gone. "My sister," he said after a moment. "She was 16 when the Blackwater gang raided our family's ranch in Colorado. 5 years ago now, understanding dawned." "That's why you became a lawman, to find them." "To stop them," he corrected. "Finding them has never been the hard part. They don't exactly hide their tracks. But they're well armed and numerous. And yet you went after them alone yesterday," Gabriella observed. A wry smile touched his lips. "Not my wisest decision, as you've pointed out." The doctor arrived that afternoon, a kindly older man who examined Zach's wound with approval. "Fine stitchwork," he told Gabriella. "You've a steady hand, Miss O'Connor." "How long before I can ride?" Zach asked. The doctor shook his head. "Not for at least a week, young man. That bullet came dangerously close to your lung. You're fortunate to be alive." Deputy Marshal Carson frowned at this news. "A week is a long time to impose on Miss O'Connor." "It's fine," Gabriella said, surprising herself. "As long as Mr. Ashford behaves himself and doesn't attract unwanted attention." The deputy seemed unconvinced but ultimately agreed to the arrangement. "Fletcher will check in daily," he told Zach, "and for God's sake, stay put this time." After they departed, an awkward silence fell over the cabin. Gabriella went about her evening chores, feeding the animals, drawing water from the well, preparing a simple supper of beans and salt pork. "You cook as well as you stitch," Zach commented as he finished his meal, having regained some of his appetite. "Basic survival skills," Gabriella replied with a shrug. "Nothing special about keeping oneself alive." "There's a difference between surviving and living," Zach observed. "I get the feeling you're just doing the former," Gabriella bristled. "You know nothing about my life, Mr. Ashford." "True enough," he conceded, "but I know something about grief and about hiding from the world because facing it hurts too much." "I'm not hiding," she insisted. "I'm being practical. A woman alone in these territories has to be cautious." "Also true," Zach acknowledged. "But there's cautious and then there's." He gestured around the isolated cabin. Gabriella set down her plate with more force than necessary. "You're awfully judgmental for a man who almost got himself killed chasing after ghosts." His expression hardened. "They're not ghosts. They're very real men who have hurt a lot of innocent people." "And getting yourself killed would have helped those people how exactly?" she challenged. They stared at each other in tense silence for several moments before Zach sighed. "You're right," he admitted. "It was foolish. I've been chasing them for so long, I sometimes forget to think clearly when an opportunity arises." Gabriella's anger deflated at his honest admission. I understand the need for justice, she said more gently, but maybe consider staying alive long enough to see it through. Zach's mouth quirked into a half-smile. Yes, madam. The next few days established an unexpected rhythm. Zach's strength improved steadily, and by the third day he was able to sit up in bed for extended periods. By the fifth, he insisted on moving to the chair by the fireplace during the day so Gabriella could reclaim her bed at night, despite her protests that she was fine sleeping on her pallet of blankets on the floor. Fletcher visited each afternoon as promised, bringing news from town and fresh supplies. There had been no further sign of the Blackwater gang in the immediate area, though reports placed them near the Idaho border, some 30 miles west. As Zach regained his strength, he found ways to make himself useful despite Gabriella's insistence that he rest. He whittled wooden pegs to repair her loose porch railing, mended a bridle that had been sitting in her tool box awaiting attention, and even taught her a more efficient way to clean her rifle. For her part, Gabriella found herself increasingly comfortable with his presence. After years of solitude, she had expected to resent the intrusion, but instead discovered she enjoyed having someone to talk with during the long evening hours. Zach told stories of his travels across the Western Territories, some amusing, some harrowing, and she found herself sharing memories of her childhood in Pennsylvania before her family had caught Western fever and moved to Montana Territory. Why did they decide to come west? Zach asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Gabriella mending a shirt while he cleaned his revolver. My father was a schoolteacher, she explained. He had romantic notions about carving out a new life in the wilderness. My mother was less enthusiastic, but she loved him enough to follow. And you, did you share his enthusiasm? Gabriella considered this. I was 16 and thought it sounded like an adventure. I had no idea how hard it would be. Do you regret coming? Zach asked. She looked around the small cabin that had been her home for nearly 10 years. Sometimes, she admitted, when winter comes early or the crops fail, but there are moments watching the sunrise over the mountains or seeing the first wildflowers bloom in spring when I can't imagine being anywhere else. Zach nodded in understanding. The West gets in your blood. What about your family? She asked. Before everything happened, a fond smile crossed his face. My father was a cattle rancher's smaller operation than most, but he was proud of it. My mother kept us all in line, including Pa. Sarah was the youngest, then me, and my older brother Thomas, who took over the ranch after. He trailed off. Do you still see them, your brother and father? Zach shook his head. Pa passed 2 years ago. Heart gave out, Thomas and I. We had different ideas about how to handle what happened to Sarah. He wanted to move on, focus on the ranch. I couldn't let it go. You were both grieving in your own ways, Gabriella observed softly. Maybe, Zach conceded, but it drove us apart all the same. Last I heard, Thomas got married and they're expecting their first child. You haven't gone back to meet your sister-in-law? Gabriella asked, surprised. Zach reassembled his gun with practiced movements. Hard to face him when I still haven't done what I set out to do. Gabriella was silent for a moment, considering his words. Justice is important, she finally said, but so is family. Your brother might understand that better than you think. Zach looked up, meeting her gaze. When did you get so wise, Gabriella O'Connor? Somewhere between stitching up a stubborn lawman and listening to him complain about my cooking, she retorted, but her smile took any sting from the words. Their easy companionship was shattered the next morning by the distant but unmistakable sound of gunfire. Zach, who had been sitting on the porch enjoying the morning sunshine, was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his holster. Stay inside, he ordered as Gabriella appeared in the doorway. Those shots came from the direction of the Henderson place, she said, worry creasing her brow. They're my nearest neighbors about 3 miles east. More shots rang out, followed by the faint sound of shouting. Zach's expression hardened. How many people live there? Just old man Henderson and his son William. They have a small horse breeding operation. Gabriella disappeared inside, returning moments later with her rifle and Zach's gun belt. Here. Zach stared at the offered weapons, then at her determined face. You can't be serious. We need to stay put and wait for Fletcher. Fletcher isn't due until afternoon, Gabriella replied. By then, it could be too late. I'm barely healed enough to ride, Zach protested. Then it's fortunate I have a gentle mare who won't jostle you too much, she countered, already moving toward the corral. Unless you'd prefer to stay behind while I go alone. Zach swore under his breath but buckled on his gun belt. Has anyone ever told you that you're impossibly stubborn? Yes, Gabriella replied, saddling her mare with quick, efficient movements. My father regularly. They rode east at a cautious pace, keeping to the cover of the tree line rather than using the more direct trail. As they approached the Henderson homestead, smoke became visible rising from behind a ridge. That's not chimney smoke, Zach observed grimly. They dismounted and proceeded on foot, Zach moving with surprising stealth despite his injury. When they crested the ridge, the scene below confirmed their worst fears. The small ranch house was ablaze, and 4 riders were herding a group of horses toward the east. 2 bodies lay motionless in the yard. Blackwater gang, Zach said quietly, recognizing one of the riders even at this distance. That's Holloway himself leading them. Gabriella's face had gone pale. Are the Hendersons? I can't tell from here, Zach replied honestly. But we're outnumbered and outpositioned. We need to get back and bring help. A flicker of movement near the burning house caught Gabriella's attention. Wait, she whispered, pointing. Someone's there. Squinting, Zach could just make out a figure huddled against the side of the barn, partially hidden by a water trough. That could be William, Gabriella said. We have to help him. If we go down there now, we'll likely get ourselves killed, Zach reasoned. The best help we can offer is to get back to your place and send Fletcher for reinforcements. Gabriella hesitated, clearly torn between immediate action and the wiser course. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. All right, but we need to hurry. They retreated to where they'd left the horse, but as they prepared to mount, Zach suddenly stiffened, his hand flying to his gun. Someone's coming, he whispered, pulling Gabriella behind a large pine tree. Moments later, a rider appeared on the trail below them, moving at a fast trot. It was a young man, his face smudged with soot and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm. It's William, Gabriella exclaimed, stepping out from their hiding place. William Henderson. The rider jerked his horse to a halt, nearly falling from the saddle as he reached for a pistol at his belt. It's me, Gabriella O'Connor, she called, raising her hands to show she meant no harm. We heard the shots. Recognition dawned on the young man's face, quickly followed by relief. Miss O'Connor, he gasped. Thank God, they killed Pa, burned everything. I need to get to the marshal. What happened? Zach asked, stepping forward. William's eyes narrowed suspiciously at the unfamiliar man. Who are you? Deputy Marshal Zachariah Ashford, Zach replied. Tell us what happened. The young man's suspicion transformed to desperate hope. They came at dawn, 6 of them. Said they needed fresh horses. Pa tried to negotiate, but their leader, a man with a scar across his cheek, shot him without warning. Victor Holloway, Zach confirmed grimly. William nodded. They started rounding up our best stock. I grabbed Pa's rifle and got off a few shots from the hayloft. Hit one of them, I think. They set fire to the house in retaliation. His voice broke. I couldn't get to Pa's body, had to run when they started searching the barn. You did the right thing, Zach assured him. Did they say where they were headed? William shook his head. No, but I overheard something about meeting the others at the old place tomorrow. Zach and Gabriella exchanged glances. The old mining settlement at Bear Creek, maybe, she suggested. It's been abandoned for years. Could be, Zach agreed. It's remote enough, and there are still some structures standing that would provide shelter. He turned back to William. We need to get back to Miss O'Connor's place. My partner Fletcher should be arriving soon, and we can formulate a plan. The ride back was tense, with all 3 constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of the Blackwater gang. When they reached Gabriella's cabin, Fletcher was already there, pacing anxiously on the porch. Where the hell have you been? He demanded as they dismounted. I was about to organize a search party. Zach quickly explained the situation while Gabriella tended to William's injured arm. Fletcher's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. If they're rendezvousing at Bear Creek, that means they're consolidating their forces, he said. Probably planning to leave the territory. Or planning something bigger, Zach suggested. Either way, we need to intercept them before they can regroup. Fletcher nodded. I'll ride to Thompson Falls immediately. The marshal can have a posse here by tomorrow noon. That might be too late, Zach argued. If they're meeting tomorrow, we need to be in position before dawn. You can't be serious, Fletcher protested. There are at least 6 of them, probably more once they meet up with the rest of the gang, and you're still recovering from a gunshot wound. I'm well enough, Zach insisted stubbornly, and this may be our best chance to finally catch Holloway. I'll go with you, William interjected, his young face set in determined lines. They murdered my father. I have a right to see justice done. No, Zach said firmly. You're injured and you're a civilian. This is a job for lawmen. Then I'll go instead, Gabriella spoke up quietly. 3 pairs of male eyes turned to her in varying degrees of disbelief. Absolutely not, Zach said immediately. Gabriella crossed her arms. I know these mountains better than any of you. I can guide you to Bear Creek by paths the Blackwater gang won't know about. It's too dangerous, Fletcher protested. More dangerous than leaving a wounded deputy and a grieving boy to face them alone, Gabriella challenged. Because that's what will happen if you ride for Thompson Falls now. You won't make it back in time with reinforcements. A tense silence fell over the group as they recognized the truth of her words. Finally, Fletcher sighed heavily. I don't like it, he said. But she's right about one thing: we don't have time to wait for a full posse. Then it's settled, Gabriella said with a note of finality. We leave at first light tomorrow. Zach opened his mouth to argue further but was silenced by the determined set of her jaw. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd found him bleeding by the creek, a look that brooked no argument. The remainder of the day was spent in preparation. Guns were cleaned, ammunition counted, provisions packed. Fletcher rode to the nearest homestead to send a message to Thompson Falls, explaining their plan and requesting backup to follow as soon as possible. As dusk fell, William finally succumbed to exhaustion and grief, falling asleep on Gabriella's pallet by the fire. Fletcher took the first watch outside, leaving Zach and Gabriella alone at the small table. You don't have to do this, Zach said quietly, watching as she methodically loaded cartridges into a leather belt. In fact, you shouldn't do this. These men are killers. Gabriella didn't look up from her task. I'm aware of the risk. Then why? Zach pressed. This isn't your fight. Now she did meet his gaze, her green eyes steady. Isn't it? The Hendersons were my neighbors. This is my home, and whether you want to admit it or not, you need my help. I've gotten by on my own for 5 years, he pointed out. Yes, and that strategy led you bleeding and half dead to my doorstep, she retorted. Zach couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. You're never going to let me forget that, are you? Not likely, Gabriella agreed, her own mouth curving slightly. The moment of levity faded quickly, however. Zach, I understand wanting to face this alone, to protect others from your battles, but sometimes we need to accept help even when we think we shouldn't. Like when a stubborn woman refuses to leave a wounded man by a creek. Exactly like that, she confirmed. Zach reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. I don't want anything to happen to you, Gabriella, if Holloway or any of his men hurt you. They won't, she said with more confidence than she felt. Besides, I'm not exactly helpless. She nodded toward her rifle leaning against the wall. Pa made sure of that. Zach squeezed her hand gently. Your father would be proud of you. Not many women or men, for that matter, would have the courage to do what you're doing. Or the foolishness, she added with a wry smile. That too, he agreed, not letting go of her hand. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire and William's soft snoring the only sounds in the cabin. Zach found himself studying Gabriella's face in the warm lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the small freckles across her nose, the strand of auburn hair that had escaped her practical braid. What? She asked, noticing his gaze. I was just thinking, he replied slowly, that when this is over we should have a proper conversation about several things. Gabriella's cheeks colored slightly. Such as why a capable, intelligent woman chooses to live alone in the wilderness, Zach said. And whether she might consider alternatives. Alternatives, Gabriella repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Zach could elaborate, Fletcher's boots sounded on the porch steps. The moment broken, Gabriella withdrew her hand and rose to prepare coffee for the returning deputy. They departed well before dawn, leaving William with strict instructions to await the marshal's posse and direct them to Bear Creek. The young man had protested being left behind, but ultimately accepted that his injured arm would make him more of a liability than an asset. As promised, Gabriella led them along narrow game trails that wound through the densely forested mountainside, avoiding the more obvious routes to the abandoned mining town. The journey was slow and arduous, particularly for Zach, whose wound ached with each jolt of his horse, but he kept pace without complaint. By mid-morning, they had reached a ridge overlooking Bear Creek. The town was little more than a collection of dilapidated structures, a few collapsed miners' shacks, a stable missing half its roof, and a somewhat more substantial building that had once served as a saloon and general store. 4 horses were hitched outside the former saloon with no sign of their riders. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that someone was inside. 4 horses, but Holloway had 6 men with him yesterday, Fletcher observed as they surveyed the scene from their hidden vantage point. The rest must not have arrived yet, Zach replied, which gives us an advantage. If we can take these 4 by surprise, we'll have better odds when the others show up. Gabriella studied the layout of the buildings. There's a back entrance to the saloon, she said. My father brought me here once when I was younger before the mine played out. The owner kept a private exit in case of trouble. Can you show us? Zach asked. She nodded. We'll need to circle around to approach from behind that ridge to stay out of sight. They left their horses secured in a small copse of trees and proceeded on foot, moving with careful stealth. As they neared the rear of the saloon, they could hear voices from within, men's laughter and the clink of bottles. Sounds like they're celebrating, Fletcher whispered. Makes our job easier if they're drunk, Zach replied, checking his revolver one final time. The back door was partially blocked by debris, but they managed to clear it enough to allow passage. Zach insisted on entering first, despite Gabriella's objection that he was still injured. Stay behind me, he instructed her firmly. If shooting starts, take cover and don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Gabriella nodded reluctantly, knowing this wasn't the time to argue. The interior of the old saloon was dim, illuminated only by a small fire in the hearth and sunlight filtering through dirty windows. 4 men sat around a table playing cards, bottles of whiskey and piles of money between them. Their guns were holstered but within easy reach. Zach and Fletcher entered silently, guns drawn, with Gabriella hanging back near the door. They were halfway across the room when a floorboard creaked under Fletcher's boot. The reaction was instantaneous. All 4 men spun toward the sound, reaching for their weapons. U.S. Marshal. Fletcher shouted. Hands where we can see them. For a fraction of a second, it seemed they might comply. Then the man furthest from them, Victor Holloway, Zach realized with a jolt of recognition, overturned the table and dove for cover, gun already in hand. The room erupted in gunfire. Gabriella pressed herself against the wall as bullets splintered the wood around her. She could see Zach and Fletcher returning fire from behind an overturned bar, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. One of Holloway's men cried out and fell, but the others maintained a steady barrage. Fletcher, Zach called over the din. Cover me. Before Gabriella could understand what he intended, Zach darted from behind the bar toward a support post, drawing fire as he moved. It was a diversion, she realized, meant to give Fletcher a better shot, but it left Zach dangerously exposed. Time seemed to slow as she saw one of the outlaws take careful aim at Zach from behind a fallen table. Without conscious thought, Gabriella raised her rifle and fired. The outlaw jerked backward, his shot going wide. The momentary advantage was all Fletcher needed. He picked off another of Holloway's men with 2 quick shots. That left only Holloway himself and one other, who seemed to realize their odds had worsened dramatically. They made a break for the front door, firing wildly as they ran. Don't let Holloway escape. Zach shouted, giving chase despite the obvious pain in his side. Gabriella followed, her heart pounding in her ears. Outside, she saw Holloway running toward the horses while his remaining companion provided covering fire. Fletcher emerged from the saloon just in time to take a bullet in the arm, spinning him around with the impact. "Fletcher," Gabriella cried, rushing to his side. "I'm all right," he gasped, though blood was seeping between the fingers clutching his arm. "Go help Zach." Gabriella hesitated only briefly before racing after Zach, who was exchanging fire with Holloway's man near the stable. As she approached, she saw Zach take cover behind a water trough, pinned down by the outlaw's relentless shooting. Holloway had nearly reached the horses. In moments, he would escape again, and all their efforts would be for nothing. Gabriella made a split-second decision, veering away from Zach toward a position that would give her a clear shot at Holloway. Gabriella, no. Zach shouted when he spotted her, but she ignored him, taking aim with her rifle. The shot rang out across the clearing, startling the hitched horses. Holloway staggered, clutching his leg, but continued his desperate lunge for his mount. Gabriella chambered another round and fired again. This time, Holloway fell and didn't rise. The remaining outlaw, seeing his leader fall, made a break for the trees. Zach emerged from cover and fired twice, dropping the man in his tracks. Sudden silence fell over the abandoned town, broken only by the nervous whinnying of the horses and Fletcher's approaching footsteps as he staggered toward them, his injured arm cradled against his chest. Zach rushed to Gabriella's side. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. She shook her head, suddenly feeling light-headed as the danger passed. "No, I'm fine, just shaking." Without warning, Zach pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Don't ever do anything that reckless again," he murmured against her hair. "That's rich coming from you," she replied, but her arms tightened around him nonetheless. "Is he dead?" Fletcher called, nodding toward Holloway's motionless form. Zach reluctantly released Gabriella and moved to check. "No," he reported after a moment, "but he's not going anywhere." He used the outlaw's own belt to bind his hands, then tore a strip from his shirt to fashion a crude tourniquet for the leg wound. 5 years, Zach said quietly, looking down at the unconscious face of Victor Holloway. 5 years I've been hunting you. Was it worth it? Gabriella asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Zach glanced up at her, then at Fletcher, who was sitting on the saloon steps examining his injured arm. "Ask me when we get these two safely to jail," he said, "but I think maybe it was." They had just finished securing the prisoners when the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Guns were raised until they recognized the lead rider as Marshal Thompson himself, followed by a dozen armed men, including a nervous-looking William Henderson. "Looks like we missed the excitement," the marshal observed dryly as he surveyed the scene. "Good work, Deputy Ashford. I had help," Zach replied, nodding toward Gabriella and Fletcher, "the kind you can't do without." The next few hours were a blur of activity as the dead were buried, the wounded tended to, and the prisoners secured for transport back to Thompson Falls. The remainder of the Blackwater gang never arrived later. They would learn that the group had split up after the Henderson raid, with only Holloway and his most trusted men planning to rendezvous at Bear Creek. By nightfall, they had established a camp near the abandoned town. The marshal insisted they wait until morning to begin the journey back, as traveling in darkness with prisoners was too risky. A fire was built, coffee brewed, and rations shared among the posse. Gabriella found herself seated beside Zach at the edge of the firelight, both of them too wired from the day's events to sleep despite their exhaustion. "How's your wound?" she asked, noticing the way he held himself carefully to avoid stretching his side. "It'll heal," he replied. "Again." "Thanks to you?" "I only shot Holloway," she pointed out. "You're the one who insisted on running around getting shot at." Zach smiled, the expression transforming his tired face. "That's not what I meant, though your marksmanship was impressive." "Then what did you mean?" He turned to face her fully. "I meant that I wouldn't have survived any of this without you, not just the physical wounds, but—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "When you found me by that creek, I was at the end of something. 5 years of chasing shadows, losing pieces of myself along the way. I was ready to die if it meant taking Holloway with me." "And now," Gabriella asked softly, "now I'm at the beginning of something," he said, his voice equally quiet. "If you'll have me." Gabriella's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying, Zach?" I'm saying that I've spent 5 years looking backward, focused on revenge, but these past days with you have shown me what I could be looking toward instead." He reached for her hand. "I know it's fast and probably foolish given we've known each other barely a week, but 8 days, Gabriella corrected with a small smile. "Not that I've been counting," Zach laughed softly. "8 days, then, long enough for me to know that I don't want to leave when this is over. Long enough to hope that maybe you feel something too." "I do," Gabriella admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire, "but I'm not sure I remember how to not be alone anymore. We could figure it out together," Zach suggested. "I was thinking of asking the marshal for a transfer. The Thompson Falls office could use another deputy, and it's not far from your homestead." "You do that?" she asked, surprised. "Give up your position to stay here?" "I'd give up more than that for a chance with you," he replied simply. Gabriella was silent for a long moment, considering his words. The idea of sharing her solitude, of letting someone into the careful life she had built, was terrifying. But the alternative, watching him ride away once this was over, was somehow more frightening still. "I think," she said finally, "that I'd like to try that, together." Zach's smile was answer enough, but he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, sealing the promise between them. The journey back to civilization was slow but uneventful. Holloway and his surviving accomplice were delivered to the Thompson Falls jail, where they would await trial for numerous charges of murder, robbery, and cattle rustling. Word spread quickly of their capture, bringing a sense of relief to a territory that had lived too long under the shadow of the Blackwater gang. Fletcher's arm wound proved relatively minor, though the doctor insisted he take at least 2 weeks to recover before returning to duty. William Henderson, with the help of neighbors and a generous collection taken up by the townspeople, began the process of rebuilding his family's ranch. As for Zach and Gabriella, they returned to her homestead, both somewhat uncertain of what came next. The marshal had readily agreed to Zach's request for transfer, understanding that the deputy had earned the right to put down roots after his long pursuit of Holloway. "It'll be at least a month before the transfer is official," Zach explained as they sat on her porch watching the sunset 2 days after their return. "But the marshal suggested I take that time to fully recover anyway, so you'll be staying here for a month." Gabriella asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "If that's all right with you," Zach replied, suddenly uncertain. "I could find lodging in town if you'd prefer." Gabriella shook her head quickly. "No, I'd like you to stay. It's been a long time since I shared my space with anyone." "I promise to be on my best behavior," Zach said with a smile that suggested otherwise. Gabriella laughed, a sound that still surprised him when he heard it. "Somehow I doubt that, Deputy Ashford." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm neither had experienced before, a shared life that gradually blended their separate routines into something new. Zach proved surprisingly adept at domestic tasks, having learned to fend for himself during his years of travel. He repaired the loose boards on the porch, patched the roof where it had begun to leak, and expanded the garden enclosure to protect it from deer. Gabriella found herself adapting to his presence with unexpected ease. She taught him how to coax the best milk from her stubborn cow, showed him the hidden patches where the sweetest berries grew in summer, and guided him through the surrounding forests until he knew them almost as well as she did. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their pasts, their hopes, the future they were tentatively building. Sometimes they wouldn't talk at all, content to share the silence that had once been Gabriella's only companion. As the month drew to a close, Zach received word that his transfer had been approved. He would report for duty in Thompson Falls the following week. "It's only a half-day's ride," he told Gabriella that evening as they prepared supper together. "I can come back every few days, or you could visit town sometimes." Gabriella nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something," she said, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "What if we didn't have to ride back and forth at all?" Zach paused in the act of setting plates on the table. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Gabriella said slowly, "that Thompson Falls has several vacant lots available for homesteading. Good land close to town. "You'd consider moving?" Zach asked, surprised, "leaving this place?" Gabriella looked around the cabin that had been her solitary refuge for so long. "This place served its purpose," she said softly. "It protected me when I needed protection. It gave me solitude when I needed to heal, but I think maybe it's time for something new." Zach set down the plates and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Gabriella O'Connor, are you proposing we start a life together?" A blush rose to her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I believe I am, Deputy Ashford, unless you have objections." "Only one," he replied, his expression serious though his eyes sparkled. "I was planning to do the proposing myself." Before Gabriella could respond, Zach reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. It was a simple gold band, unadorned but brightly polished. "I bought this in town yesterday," he explained, suddenly looking nervous. "I was going to wait for the right moment, but it seems you've beaten me to it." Gabriella stared at the ring, then at Zach's face. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "These past weeks have shown me that what we have is rare and precious. I love you, Gabriella. I want to build a life with you, whether it's here or in town or wherever our path leads us." Tears filled Gabriella's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Zach slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and promise of their future together. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Thompson Falls, with Fletcher standing as best man and, to everyone's surprise, Thomas Ashford arriving from Colorado with his pregnant wife to witness his brother's happiness. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward warmer and more joyful than Gabriella could have imagined. "I have something for you," Thomas told Zach as the celebration wound down. He handed his brother a folded document. "Pa would have wanted you to have this." Zach opened it to find the deed to a parcel of their family's ranch land. "Thomas, I can't accept this." "You can and you will," his brother insisted. "It's your birthright and there's more than enough for both of us." He glanced at Gabriella, who was deep in conversation with his wife. "Besides, I have a feeling Montana might not be your permanent home." Zach followed his brother's gaze to his new wife. "What makes you say that?" Thomas smiled knowingly. "Just a hunch. She reminds me of someone." "Sarah," Zach said softly, the comparison having occurred to him as well. "Not in looks, but in spirit." "She would have liked Gabriella," Thomas agreed. "And she would have been proud of you, Zach, for seeing justice done, but more importantly, for finding happiness afterward." The brothers embraced, years of distance melting away in shared memories and renewed connection. Later that night, as Gabriella and Zach lay in the small room they had rented above the town's hotel, she asked him about the document. "It's land," he explained, tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Part of my family's ranch in Colorado. Will you want to go back?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Zach considered this. "Maybe to visit. Thomas and I have a lot of catching up to do, and I'd like you to see where I grew up, but as for living there..." He kissed her forehead gently. "Home isn't a place for me anymore, Gabriella. It's wherever you are." Gabriella smiled, nestling closer to him. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for those rustlers. The ones who shot me," Zach asked, amused. She confirmed. "If they hadn't, you wouldn't have collapsed by my creek, and I wouldn't have found you." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Zach agreed, pulling her closer. "Though I'd prefer it didn't involve quite so much blood next time." "Next time," Gabriella repeated teasingly. "Planning on getting shot again, Deputy?" "Not if I can help it," he replied, suddenly serious. "I have too much to live for now." They did eventually visit Colorado, the following spring after the winter snows had melted enough to make travel possible. Gabriella fell in love with the rugged beauty of the mountains and the sprawling grasslands of the Ashford Ranch. Thomas and his wife Emily had welcomed a healthy baby boy named James after their father, and the two families formed an immediate bond. To Zach's surprise, Gabriella took to ranch life with natural ease. "It reminds me of Pennsylvania in some ways," she explained as they rode the boundaries of the property one afternoon. "Open spaces, room to breathe, but with community nearby when you need it. You could be happy here," Zach observed, watching her face as she surveyed the landscape. "I could be happy anywhere with you," she replied honestly. "But yes, I think I could love it here." The decision wasn't made overnight, but by the time they returned to Montana, both knew they would eventually make Colorado their permanent home. Zach continued his work as a deputy in Thompson Falls, while Gabriella sold her homestead to a young couple eager to start their own Western adventure. Within a year, they had relocated to Colorado, building a small house on the parcel Thomas had deeded to Zach. Close enough to the main ranch for family gatherings, yet private enough for their independent spirits, Zach took on a position with the local sheriff's office, his experience and reputation making him a welcome addition to the force. Gabriella, to everyone's surprise, including her own, discovered a talent for breeding and training horses, working alongside Thomas to expand that aspect of the ranch's operations. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after the sister Zach had lost. A son followed 2 years later, named Michael after Gabriella's father. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, Zach surprised Gabriella with a picnic beside a small creek that ran through their property. As they sat watching their children play under the watchful eye of Emily, who had insisted on giving them some time alone, Gabriella leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "When I found you by the creek," Zach smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Only every day. You were so stubborn," she recalled, "telling me I shouldn't have come, and you were so defiant," he countered. "Then stop needing me, you said, as if I ever could." Gabriella turned to face him, her green eyes as bright and determined as they had been that day. "I needed you too, you know, I just didn't realize it then." "I know," Zach said, kissing her softly. "That's why I'll never stop being grateful that you found me, Mrs. Ashford, even though I refuse to leave you alone," she teased. "Especially because of that," he replied, watching as their daughter chased a butterfly through the wildflowers. "Some men spend their whole lives looking for the thing that will save them. I was lucky enough to have it find me instead." Gabriella smiled, content in the knowledge that the solitary path she had once walked had led her here to family, to love, to a life fuller and richer than she had ever dared to imagine. All because she had found a wounded cowboy collapsed near a creek and refused to leave him behind.